Our first speaker for today is Peter Edwards. Peter is a political scientist, is that right? Got the right one? Peter is a political scientist at Scion. He has a PhD in sociology, political science from Griffith University and a background in forest ecology and environmental science. Peter, are you ready to go? Your timekeepers are in the front here.
Just leave that right there. Great. Thanks to Melanie and the others for the opportunity to speak at this. So what I'm actually going to present today is not sort of a project that's so really part of the biological heritage thing, but it has quite a few strong synergies. So it's Our Land and Water pilot that is hopefully going to turn into an MB Endeavour research program shortly. So it'll be fairly sort of general and broad, and hopefully a bit of thought-provoking. So I guess thinking about social license to operate, kind of across all of New Zealand, whether it's sort of land, marine, etc., there's quite a bit of intensifying land use. There's a huge sort of risk to, both, in terms of our biological heritage, so biodiversity, markets, humans, communities, and sort of the health of sort of, entire ecosystems, as well as the social and potentially even the economic health of communities and industries. So I guess without community acceptance or kind of the social license, industry that's wanting to expand or intensify or even start up, can, in an awful lot of instances, basically have this to look forward to: protests, people that are really unhappy with what they're proposing. We already see this in sort of the oil and gas industries, mining, forestry, maybe not so much now, but in the past it certainly has been a huge issue. And, along with sort of those traditional sort of, I guess, really visible industries that can cause quite a bit of disruption, we're starting to see it, maybe not so much here yet, but sort of with genetically modified organisms in agriculture, the dairy expansion, and it's, I guess, in today's sort of era, it's not just, I guess, physical protests like this. It can also be sort of social media campaigns that, have a much, much greater sort of, I guess, spatial reach than, these kind of physical protests. So it's kind of this, ever expanding sort of possibility of protest or disruption or unacceptance of sort of the activities that industries are wanting to do. So sort of with that little bit of background, I guess sort of that kind of visual picture, sort of give a few little ideas about social license to operate. So it's, I guess since coming to New Zealand, I've noticed that it's gained quite a few different sort of names. So, license to operate, social license, privilege to operate, social responsibility, community license, how we do business. So it's very much kind of couched in industry terms. So it is basically an industry term. It came out of the forest industry and the mining industries in the 1990s, and it was an attempt at that point for them to come up with something to, I guess, improve their image. They'd been battered by extensive protests, particularly mining in sort of developing areas, particularly South America. The forest industry, a really good case in point is the forest industry in British Columbia, which essentially turned into a war in the woods. So they were trying to basically improve their reputation, so build themselves back up in the eyes of the community and sort of the public at large. And what they envisioned was kind of ongoing kind of community and stakeholder approval, engagement with those communities so that they would actually accept what they were doing in those communities. And it was all sort of couched around resource development. So how could they engage with the communities, and, I guess in a way kind of share some of the risk, understand that the risk that the communities were taking on, and kind of give something back that would, mitigate that risk and allow them to operate sort of peacefully throughout the course of that particular development. So there's kind of, I guess you might sort of ask, why would we need social license? So there's quite a good diagram that I've found recently that essentially companies for the most part, have to get some sort of legal, let's call it license. So they have to get permission from the regulator to operate. And the requirements that the legislation or the regulation allows is at a certain level, but it's most often not at the same level that society expects. So society actually expects a higher level of whatever sort of cleanness, greenness, social sort of responsibility. And what social license is basically the kind of more intangible thing that fills that gap. So what do sort of the companies have to do that is more than the legally required, but will actually meet what society expects? So I can just, as I said, skip through that because mention that it's basically hopefully an MB-funded research program. So our sort of whole premise in both sort of the pilot and our hopefully eventual research program is trust. So quite a bit of work that's been done in Australia by the CSIRO has found that there's sort of those five key elements. So how, kind of the quality of engagement, how well industries or companies actually engage with communities, how often they engage, the perceived fairness, so whether the actual process itself is perceived as fair, and kind of the whole issue around social infrastructure, but they all impact on the trust that the community has. So we've sort of hypothesized that building that trust between industry and community members, and again, sort of the trust in amongst community members, is actually the key to social license. And once you have that trust built, it's quite easy for a particular development to move from kind of unacceptance to acceptance and being approved by the community. So I guess one of the things, what is trust? So I guess on sort of the broadest scale, trust is basically two or more parties basically meeting their mutual expectations. So if a particular individual does what they say they will do, and as that sort of, I guess, relationship builds and people gain sort of that knowledge or the experience of that individual or that particular entity, doing what they say they will do, that is one of the core things of actually building up trust. And it comes with, the amount of engagement or the amount of contact that people have with each other. And sort of the knowledge, how the process is fair. You could also, it's quite a bit controversial, but you can also add in transparency and accountability, also influence it. And one of the things that we're looking at is this aspect of truth. So Michel Foucault basically has said that truth is necessary to build trust. But what happens when you have, as we've sort of seen, particularly with the rise of Donald Trump and others, this post-truth society where you've got alternative facts, etc., which essentially erode trust. So, part of our project is actually looking at that. When you don't have that sort of truth element, how can you actually build trust in sort of in amongst communities and between communities and industry. Now, I guess not only that, so we've sort of set the scene, and I guess, you know, if we're looking at sort of that resource development, it's usually kind of, let's call it right at the front line. So it's you know, the mine in your, you know, in your community, or it's, you know, the forest that's there to be cut down, or, you know, the fish farm in your backyard in the Marlborough Sounds. But all the way up kind of the value chain or the supply chain, you've got sort of different sort of developments with that resource. And while each of those, you know, has its own sort of, I guess let's call it geographic community, how does the sort of acceptance or non-acceptance of a particular activity up or down the value chain or supply chain impact the other elements in it? So we're now starting to kind of expand beyond the sort of geographic area to sort of a much broader, let's call it, community of interest. So how does, for example, let's say the individual in, let's say, Belgium that's purchasing that particular timber from New Zealand, and they may decide that they don't like something in somewhere along the chain. So how does that sort of community of interest that's quite far away, that's really associated actually only with this end part of the value chain, how does that impact each sort of step down the value chain and whether it's accepted or not accepted? I probably should have gone to the next one. So I mean, essentially that's just what I've sort of explained. So each of those sort of steps in the chain has their own community, but how each of them impacts on the other is quite sort of unknown, you might say. Okay. So basically, one of my colleagues back in British Columbia has come up with sort of this, I guess, kind of framework where kind of melding social responsibility and social license. You know, it's basically, we're not really able to measure it, and this is, I guess, kind of a bit of a vague sort of framework. You know, it kind of proposes that, you know, environmental performance, you know, sort of social performance all impact in that sort of come together around a social license. But I guess we're interested in sort of looking, you know, a little bit deeper at the environmental aspect, so, you know, environmental compliance, but also how and when people actually engage with stakeholders. You know, how does, you know, the social costs or other externalities, particularly in some of the agricultural sectors, how does that impact on social license, and how can we build a framework around that encompasses sort of as much as possible? Yeah. So I guess this is just sort of a little bit of the framework that we've sort of developed to, I guess, start off this project. So, you know, looking at sort of how we explore trust, particularly in the post-truth society, then sort of basically that is kind of the, you know, how we take that in the human interface, the engagement, and end up with a framework, and how we then apply that framework across the value chain and sort of for all the primary sectors. And I guess, you know, there's actually quite a few, I guess, benefits both for sort of the community, but also for the industry. You know, there's certainly the social and the environmental benefits, but there's also potentially economic benefits for community and industry. So they end up with, you know, potentially, if we look at it from an industry perspective, less time tied up in the consenting process and objections and court time. They can also potentially gain an advantage through sort of branding, marketing, you know, and there's increasing sort of, I guess, benefit. You see it in Australia, where sort of without a kind of perceived social license, mining and large-scale industrial developments aren't gaining financing from banks. And it's also about sort of gaining resources. So people are increasingly, not wanting to work for companies that aren't seen as having a social license. So I'm going to skip that one because I dealt with it. So this is sort of just kind of a wrapping up kind of graphic. So I guess there's essentially, we can kind of sum this up in sort of two ways. There's, I guess, two different roads that industry and sort of communities together can take. There is, there's basically the nice smoothly paved road that sort of goes along with public trust, where you've got engagement, consultation, transparency, and sort of, in the case, this is specific to sort of British Columbia, having independent oversight over all of that. And you end up with public trust, and people are quite happy to accept what's happening. Or you can sort of choose the sort of not to do that and end up with, sort of lawsuits, court time. Basically, you end up repeating the history that as we've seen sort of so much of in BC and other places. Now, I guess a few sort of final thoughts. They're not quite such crazy ideas, but I guess, sort of reflecting on yesterday what Jan Wright said, I guess in a way I agree with her that social license might not actually be the right term for particularly kind of conservation type issues, because it did come out of the industry, and it is a term that the general sort of public actually doesn't understand that well. Not that industry or others really understand it in a lot of ways either, but the second thing, I guess it relates a fair bit actually to a lot of the arguments that Maori have, that often industries engage with representatives of particular groups. And communities are made up of far more than just individual or multiple groups. They are individuals, and I think sort of from the Western perspective, we can learn a lot from the Maori in that way, that we need to find sort of a way to engage with individuals in the community. And I guess just to sort of outline sort of thank you to our sort of collaborators and partners from CSIRO, UTAS, Otago, Plant and Food, and Lincoln. So.
So picking up on your last point, I guess, I'd really like to believe in social acceptance, but I have trouble knowing how much we need. And that's, if we look at Brexit, is it 51%? If we look at climate change, is it less than 2% of scientists in opposition? Predator-free New Zealand, is it 2 out of 7 panellists? How do we measure it? How can you make me believe in social acceptance as a measure for going forward?
I guess sort of I wouldn't be able to make you believe in it as a measure. In a way, I guess social license itself, on one hand, is somewhat immeasurable. I know there are certain research sort of projects out there that are attempting to sort of measure it, but I guess it's very sort of context specific. So, and that's, I guess, kind of the tension between that close geographical sort of area where you can often get the majority of people on board accepting a particular sort of project, and it doesn't. I guess it doesn't have to necessarily be approval, but it's just simply that you accept that project, that development is actually going ahead. But once you start to expand out beyond that geographic community, I think it becomes a lot more difficult, and there's certainly I have no answers.
flashed up a little bit there about British Columbia independent oversight and verification.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like an environmental audit? We have here in New Zealand economic audits, but it'd be great to have environmental audits.
Yeah, so after that, the war in the woods in the sort of mid-90s in BC, when basically the forest industry went imploded, the government established something called the Forest Practices Board of British Columbia. So it doesn't report to sort of the government of the day. It reports to the legislature, and it's basically sort of a forestry ombudsman. So if people bring up, complaints or issues, or they do their own sort of auditing as well. They go out and investigate and can sanction forest industry players that aren't following the Forest Practices Code. So
So that builds up trust,
it does.
having
Yes.
a body like that.
Yeah.